You may never have realized it, but Alan Watts used to say that life has a peculiar way of placing everyone exactly where they don't want to be, and yet, exactly where they need to be. It's an uncomfortable idea, almost offensive at first glance, but it carries a force that imposes itself like a silent blow. What if the place that hurt you the most was precisely the spot where your awakening began, not out of justice, not out of punitive destiny, but because human consciousness only awakens when the surface is cracked? Watts claimed that existence seems to play hide-and-seek with the essential within chaos, as if the universe knew that it only seeks those who have lost everything they believed they controlled. From an early age, many of us grew up in environments where love was confusing, where home seemed more like an emotional battlefield than a refuge. Families filled with harsh voices, unpredictable gestures, heavy silences, patterns so distorted that it was difficult to even name what was happening. And you wonder why a sensitive, intuitive soul, capable of perceiving nuances that no one else notices, would have been born precisely there. Watts said that this question is the beginning of all transformation, because it is not born in those who have lived in stability, but in those who have lived with friction. He believed that life doesn't awaken anyone with gentle embraces. It awakens with discomfort. Discomfort is the universe's finger nudging your shoulder saying, "Look deeper." It's strange to think this way, but toxic families have a peculiar, almost alchemical effect. They shatter the illusion that the world is simple, predictable, and ordered. They force you to realize too early that human beings are a mixture of light and shadow, and that love can come poisoned, conditioned, and distorted. Watts said that this is not a condemnation. It's a brutal invitation to see beyond the obvious. Because while others remain asleep within comfortable normality, you have been pushed to the edge of perception, and whoever touches the edge sees what no one else sees. But here an uncomfortable question arises. If the universe is as vast, as intelligent as Watts believed, why allow so many sensitive souls to be born into environments that seem to deny them from the start? Perhaps the answer lies not in the pain itself, but in the kind of perspective it produces. Those who grow up in chaos learn early on that the outside world is not a reliable foundation. This forces an inner search. It forces you to realize that there is something within you that has not been affected by the noise, something that observes everything with a silent lucidity. Watts called this the true self, the core of consciousness that remains intact even when everything around it falls apart. It's possible you've felt this inner presence during moments of solitude, in brief pauses between conflicts, in thoughts that arose with a clarity that didn't match your surroundings. As if something inside you was whispering, "That's not all there is, that's not what love truly is. There's something greater." And somehow you knew that this voice wasn't delusion, wasn't escapism, it was perception. Watts saw this voice as the first spark of awakening, the beginning of a consciousness that starts to remember itself. Of course, this doesn't mean the suffering was good. Watts would never romanticize it. He said that calling pain necessary is a poor way to explain it. It's not pain that teaches. It's what it forces you to question. It's what it pushes you to reveal. Pain is not the teacher. It's the push that launches you into the true teacher, your own consciousness. And that's where everything changes. Because a question begins to grow like a stubborn seed within the mind. Who would I be if I hadn't been shaped by chaos? This question is not about nostalgia. It's about essence. It marks the beginning of a silent process of liberation. Watts said that awakening is realizing that you are not the story they told you, nor the story your family tried to impose, nor the patterns they repeated before you as if they were inevitable. You are the consciousness that perceives all of that, and when that perception arises, even if only for a second, the whole of life changes texture. Pain is no longer just pain. It becomes a symbol. Chaos is no longer just chaos. It becomes a mirror. And family is no longer just a wound. It becomes a portal. At this point, you might begin to notice something that previously seemed impossible. Your sensitivity, the same sensitivity that has been crushed so many times, is not weakness. It is radar. It is an instrument for reading reality. It is the compass that allows you to perceive in depth what others ignore. Watts said that the sensitive person is not the fragile one. It is the attuned one. And that which is attuned captures frequencies that the rest of the world does not hear. But if all of this is true, one last question arises that may be puzzling. If this awakening began amidst chaos, then what exactly is emerging within you now? Watts would respond that what awakens is not an improved version of the ego. It is something much older, much vaster, something that was dormant, waiting for exactly the kind of impact that its history produced. And it is at this point that the first part of the journey ends. Because before moving forward, it is necessary to understand the most essential thing. Nothing you have experienced was small. Nothing was wasted. Each rupture opened space for something greater to move. And this movement, silent, profound, almost imperceptible, has already begun within you. The question now is no longer, why did this happen? But what is being revealed through you? Alan Watts used to say that the universe works in layers, and that the first layer never reveals the true purpose of the experiences we live through. In the beginning, everything seems chaotic, as if life had decided to throw you into absurd, unfair, and incomprehensible situations. But Watts asserted that friction is not a mistake. It's a calling that rarely arrives in the form of peace. It reveals itself in small pains, in scenes that repeat themselves, in moments when you wonder why nothing seems to fit together. And it is at this point that friction begins to acquire a meaning that, little by little, changes everything. Perhaps you remember a simple episode, sitting at the table while your parents argued about things that didn't make sense, and you felt that strange mixture of fear and lucidity. It was as if something inside you perceived that that environment didn't correspond to what your soul recognized as truth. Or perhaps you've lived through moments when, even as a child, you knew that an adult's attitude was profoundly wrong, even if no one else seemed to notice. Watts said that this kind of early perception doesn't arise by chance. It arises from a deep sensitivity, from a gaze that sees cracks on the surface before they become obvious. It's a gaze that many carry without understanding where it came from. For Watts, friction isn't suffering itself, but the inability to accept the world as it's presented to you. It's that feeling that the standards they try to force you to conform to are too narrow for who you really are. Perhaps you felt this in adolescence, when you tried to behave like everyone else, but something in you simply didn't fit. Or when they tried to convince you that certain aggressive attitudes were normal, and you, even silently, knew they weren't. This type of internal conflict creates a force that grows slowly, silently, but constantly. Watts believed that this discomfort is, paradoxically, the first movement of awakening. He compared the experience to a grain of sand inside an oyster. It irritates, hurts, bothers. At first, you just want to get rid of it. You want to escape the environment. You want to forget the memories. You want to erase everything that hurt you. But over time, you realize that the experience won't go away. It remains there like a fissure that insists on drawing your attention. However, it is precisely there that the process begins to change texture. Because, without realizing it, you begin to coat that pain with understanding. The question, why did this happen to me, begins to transform into, what did this awaken within me? And it is at this exact point that something unexpected begins to happen. You notice that certain skills were born from these experiences. For example, the ability to read emotions on people's faces before they say a word, the ability to sense the atmosphere of a room as soon as you enter it, the ability to perceive hidden intentions, to identify risks that others simply ignore. For Watts, this is not a side effect, it is a spiritual adaptation. He said that intense suffering reorganizes consciousness, as pressure transforms coal into diamonds. Not through moral merit, but out of necessity. The soul learns to survive by expanding its perception. Perhaps you remember when, still very young, you began to notice familiar patterns repeating themselves like an endless cycle. Outbursts of anger followed by empty apologies, broken promises, silences that lasted for days, manipulations so subtle they seemed natural. While many people simply incorporated these behaviors without questioning, you felt an inner resistance. Watts said that this is the exact point where the second stage of consciousness is born, silent rebellion. Not a rebellion of shouts, but the intimate refusal to accept that this is destiny, a deep feeling that there is another way, even if you cannot yet see it. This rebellion appears out of nowhere, in everyday moments. It arises when you decide not to respond as expected, when you choose to remain silent in the face of provocation, when you walk away before the situation explodes, when you realize you can choose not to participate in the destructive pattern. These small decisions, almost invisible to others, are enormous for the soul. They are the first conscious steps towards emotional autonomy. Watts explained that awakening never begins with grand events, but with internal choices so subtle that only you know they happened. But there's an even more subtle shift in the awakening. After so long trying to understand what's wrong with the environment, you begin to realize that the issue isn't just the behavior of the people around you. The real key lies in what it's producing within you. A different, deeper restlessness arises, as if your mind were trying to reorganize everything you've learned, and suddenly you realize that something has begun to change in the way you see love. Love ceases to be what you were taught, full of conditions, control, psychological games, and becomes something you intuit in a completely new, almost instinctive way. Watts believed that this reconstruction of the meaning of love is one of the most important steps on the spiritual journey. He said that no one who grew up in healthy environments is forced to question love. They simply reproduce it. But those who have been hurt need to redefine love from scratch. They need to discover what it is when it doesn't come mixed with pain. This search, according to Watts, is the exact moment when consciousness separates itself from inherited illusions and begins to observe clearly. And then comes one last revelation, the one many try to avoid. You realize you can no longer go back to being who you were. Something within you has changed definitively. The friction has left its mark, but it has also opened doors. You begin to realize that your sensitivity is, in fact, a tool, that your restlessness is a compass, that your pain was the fertile ground where something essential began to germinate. Watts would say that this is how awakening infiltrates life, not as a luminous promise, but as a silent change that makes it impossible to continue living unconsciously. And it is at that moment so discreet and yet so profound that the story of your consciousness takes its first great turn, because you are not merely reacting to the world around you, you are beginning to question it. And when a human being begins to question their own reality, nothing remains the same. Alan Watts said that true rebellion doesn't happen when someone shouts, but when someone finally sees. Inner rebellion is born in the silent instant, when you realize that what you called normal was always just a set of inherited patterns. And it is precisely at this point that something begins to crumble. The old structure, emotional, mental, even spiritual, begins to show deep cracks. You no longer react as before. You no longer believe as before. You no longer accept what you once swallowed out of inertia. It's as if a second, observing self emerges within you, a self that Watts described as the beginning of true awakening. It's not noise, it's clarity. This clarity manifests itself in situations that previously went unnoticed. Suddenly, you notice the aggressive tone of voice your family members always used, but which only now sounds clearly abusive. Or you realize that certain jokes that always hurt you were never innocent. You notice that certain attitudes repeated for years were not normal. They were masked violence. And upon seeing this, something inside you refuses to continue living according to someone else's logic. What once seemed impossible now emerges as a choice. And that is the power of clarity. It gives you back options. But this clarity brings another unexpected consequence. When you begin to see, you also begin to feel an emotional detachment that at first glance is frightening. You no longer react with the same intensity. The attack that once destroyed you now finds silence. The manipulation that once confused you now makes you nauseous. The repetition of the pattern no longer captures you as it once did. This detachment is natural, and Watts said that it is not coldness. It is consciousness trying to reorganize itself. The mind is choosing for the first time not to merge with chaos. And this raises an inevitable question. If you no longer conform to the norm, who exactly is beginning to emerge within you? As this new awareness grows, a curious phenomenon appears. Old memories begin to change shape, not because they've stopped hurting, but because you can finally look at them without confusion. You see the child you once were, trying to understand adult environments that never made sense. You see the teenager trying to behave correctly, while the world around always seemed on the verge of collapse. You see the young adult who believed that love meant enduring everything. But now, looking back with this new clarity, you realize that none of that defined your essence. They were just adaptations, survival strategies, necessary masks. It is at this point that inner rebellion transforms into something deeper, discernment. Watts said that discernment is when you realize you don't need to defend yourself from the past, only understand it. And this understanding generates another unexpected change. You begin to notice that, contrary to what you believed for years, you were never weak. In fact, you needed to be too strong too soon. What they called sensitivity was, in reality, heightened perception. What they called exaggeration was a natural response to absurdity. What they called ingratitude was simply you trying to breathe. Then another provocative question arises. How many versions of yourself were created just to endure moments that should never have happened? When this perception solidifies, something even deeper happens. You stop looking for answers in the behavior of others and begin to perceive the internal movement. You start to notice how your body reacts when someone tries to manipulate you. You begin to see how your mind protects itself when it perceives emotional risks. You begin to feel a kind of internal radar that instinctively guides you away from destructive situations. Watts said that this radar is the voice of conscience awakening, finally free from external noise. And this voice doesn't lie. It is direct, clear, precise. But this is where a surprising turning point emerges. The more you awaken, the more you realize that true rebellion isn't about distancing yourself. It's about understanding. Understanding without justifying, comprehension without acceptance, seeing clearly without hurting yourself again. It's as if the universe is handing you a new lens, capable of seeing the pain inherited through generations, not as destiny, but as a clumsy pattern that you can now clearly distinguish. And this clarity creates a kind of lucid, unsentimental compassion, a compassion that doesn't ask for reconciliation, that doesn't demand forgiveness, that doesn't want to romanticize the past, only to acknowledge it as it was. And then another question arises, almost whispered. What happens when you finally understand that you no longer need to carry anything that wasn't born from you? In this process, a profound revelation begins to take shape. You realize that, contrary to what you imagined, it wasn't the pain that shaped you. It was the inner movement you created to survive it. The pain was merely the trigger. The real work was all yours. Watts would say that it is precisely at this point that true change is born. Not when you reject your history, but when you finally realize that it is not who you are. It is merely the path by which you arrived at what truly matters. And suddenly, what seemed like a burden transforms into a tool. What seemed like trauma transforms into a reference point. What seemed like failure transforms into insight. And this realization, when it finally settles in, creates the strangest sensation of all. You begin to feel that something greater is about to emerge. A new identity. Sharper, firmer, more your own. As if a whole version of yourself were forming behind the inner walls, just waiting for the right moment to break through. Watts would compare this to a symbolic birth, a rebirth that doesn't depend on external circumstances, but on a silent decision that takes place deep within the soul. And this brings us to the final point of this section. Inner rebellion is no longer just a reaction to the past. Now it becomes a choice, an affirmation, a stance, the beginning of a conscious identity that no longer accepts living on autopilot. And almost imperceptibly, you realize that you are no longer trying to survive the environment that shaped you. You are beginning to overcome it from the inside out. And the question that defines the transition to the next stage arises. If this new consciousness is emerging now, what will it be able to transform next? Alan Watts said that no one is an island. According to him, each person is the visible tip of a deep current that runs through generations, cultures, and memories that aren't entirely your own, but that you carry even without realizing it. And it's at this point that the narrative of your life begins to expand into something much larger than the story of your childhood. When you begin to see your family clearly, something unexpected happens. You realize that their behavior didn't originate with them. They simply repeated a cycle that probably began long before anyone you knew was born. And suddenly, your story ceases to be just yours. This realization can arise in a simple moment, like finding an old photograph in a drawer. Perhaps that black and white image of a grandfather you barely knew, with an austere, distant gaze, too rigid for someone so young. Or perhaps a casual conversation with a relative reveals that your mother or father suffered the exact same patterns you faced, only disguised by another era, another language, another form of pain. In many families, there are accounts of improbable trajectories that almost no one talks about. A relative who disappeared without explanation, a marriage destroyed by extreme jealousy, a son expelled from home, a grandmother who never spoke about her own childhood. Broken stories that remain kept in silence. Watts said that these inherited silences are as important as the facts. It's surprising to realize how patterns can transcend time as if they were living organisms. Modern epigenetic studies show that traumas can leave real marks on the human body and be biologically transmitted across generations, not in the form of memories, but as emotional sensitivities, automatic reactions, and seemingly unfounded fears. A great-grandfather who lived through a war might pass on to a great-great-grandchild the tendency to always be on alert, even without knowing why. A grandmother who lost a child might transmit an irrational fear of abandonment to grandchildren who never heard her story. Watts didn't talk about genetics, but he said that the pain of lineage settles in the soul like layers of dust on a mirror. You see yourself through these layers until you begin to clean them away. But there are events so improbable that they seem almost like fiction. In many families, there are reports of strange repetitions, people who died at the same age, identical conflicts that arise in different generations, marriage patterns that repeat themselves with unsettling precision, even names that return, as if the family were trying to resolve something it never managed to. Some psychologists call this invisible loyalties, an unconscious force that keeps someone trapped in a destiny they did not choose. Watts, with his philosophical vision, said that this happens because life tries to complete itself through us. What was not seen in one generation tries to be seen in the next. What was not healed returns, insistent, waiting for someone capable of interrupting the cycle. It is at this point that something extraordinary emerges. You begin to realize that, of all the people in your family, you are the one who sees the pattern, not because you are better, but because you are more sensitive, more attentive, more capable of questioning. And that changes everything, because whoever sees has a responsibility. Not responsibility in the sense of guilt, but in the sense of possibility. Watts said that the universe doesn't awaken someone by chance. It awakens precisely the one who can sustain the necessary awareness to break a sequence that has been repeated without interruption. It is a silent but powerful movement. By understanding your own history, you begin to heal something that didn't start within you. But this revelation brings another unexpected layer. You realize that your parents, despite everything, were also victims. They didn't know how to do things differently. Perhaps they even tried in some twisted way to break the pattern, but they didn't have the inner tools you have now. And this doesn't justify the pain, but it explains its origin. It explains why certain phrases were said, why certain behaviors were repeated, why love was given in a distorted way. Wounded people cannot love clearly, and when you understand this deeply, not as an excuse but as understanding, the anger begins to lose its weight within you. Something even more impressive begins to emerge when you look back with this renewed understanding. Moments in your life take on new meaning. A seemingly pointless argument reveals itself as an explosion of pain that wasn't yours. A cold gesture from a relative transforms in your memory into a sign of emotional incapacity, not lack of worth. And memories that once hurt you begin to reorganize themselves like pieces of a larger puzzle. Watts said that clarity doesn't change the past, but it changes how you carry it. That changes everything. Then a turning point occurs. You realize you're the first in your lineage to truly see the complexity of family pain, and that means something immense. It means you're the first one capable of interrupting the flow, the first one who doesn't need to repeat history, the first one who doesn't need to reproduce the chaos. The first one who can consciously choose who they will be from now on. Watts compared this to a river that has flowed in the same direction for centuries and suddenly finds a fork in the road. You are the fork, and what you do now alters the entire course of what comes next. This realization transforms inner rebellion into something greater, spiritual responsibility. You realize that when you heal yourself, you also heal a hidden part of the entire family, not because you will change others, but because you interrupt the transmission. Future generations, children, nephews, grandchildren, even people you may never meet, will be affected by the change you make now. It's surprising to think that a silent inner movement, happening only in your consciousness, has the power to interrupt a cycle that no one before has been able to stop. And it is precisely in this intertwining of past and future that you begin to feel the depth of what you are experiencing. The pain you faced was not just pain. It was the opening of a door that no one before had been able to cross. And now, with this clarity, the question arises that marks the next step. What will you do with this power to transform what seemed impossible to change? Alan Watts said that awakening is not about reaching a perfect state of peace, but about seeing reality without the filters that previously hid what is essential. And when you reach the point where you finally see your family clearly, something profound happens. The vision ceases to be emotional and becomes structural. You stop looking at the past as a sequence of wounds and begin to see it as a map full of clues, signs, and repetitions that reveal the hidden logic behind everything. But this lucidity doesn't arrive smoothly. It emerges as a growing tension, as if the universe itself were pushing you against the wall and asking if you are ready to see what comes next. This moment is strange because, for the first time, you realize you're dealing not just with memories, but with reflections that still live within you. Suddenly, an unexpected impulse arises. Perhaps you're in a casual conversation and notice you almost repeated a typical phrase from someone who hurt you. Or perhaps in a moment of irritation, you realize your tone of voice has become identical to that of a relative you swore never to imitate. This discovery can be shocking. You always thought you had freed yourself from the past, but you realize that parts of it are still trying to infiltrate. Watts said this is the critical point of awakening. The moment you discover that it's not enough to understand the pattern, you need to confront it within yourself. This revelation brings unexpected tension. It's not enough to break the cycle externally. You need to deactivate it internally. This means questioning automatic impulses, doubting reactions that seem natural, revising old beliefs you never truly chose. It's like cleaning a dark house with a weak flashlight and realizing there's more dust than you imagined. And then comes the first great test. Can you recognize when the pattern tries to repeat itself through you? Can you perceive the exact second when that which destroyed generations tries to use your voice, your body, your emotion? It's a silent but powerful confrontation, and it defines who you will be from now on. Over time, something even more unexpected happens. You realize it's not just the past trying to pull you back. The present is also testing you. Everyday situations begin to reveal your true transformation. Perhaps someone tries to manipulate you like your family members did. Perhaps someone tries to awaken in you the old guilt that always acted like a chain. Perhaps romantic relationships, friendships, or work colleagues repeat old triggers with surprising precision, as if life were staging old plays to see if you still fall into the old role. Watts said that the universe tests you exactly at the point where you believe you have won. Not out of cruelty, but because only then do you discover if you have truly changed. And then a kind of internal upheaval happens. Some simple, almost banal event reveals that you are no longer who you were. It might be an argument that doesn't break you. It might be an insult that doesn't penetrate. It might be manipulation that you perceive in the first second. Or it might be a silence that once suffocated you, but now seems light. This moment has no fireworks, no announcement. It's almost too discreet, but it carries enormous power. You realize that something deep within you is finally free. Watts said that this is the instant when consciousness ceases to be a victim and becomes an observer. And whoever observes has power. But this freedom doesn't come without its final obstacle. When you begin to act with emotional maturity, some people around you start to react in unexpected ways. People accustomed to controlling you try to pull you back. Others accuse you of having changed too much. Others try to awaken in you the old guilt that no longer works. This moment can generate an emotional shock because you clearly realize how certain bonds were never love, they were dependence. Watts said that one of the greatest signs of awakening is when you realize who benefited from your unconsciousness. As this unfolds, an unexpected strength emerges within you. It's not anger, it's not pride, it's not superiority. It's a quiet firmness, a silent certainty. You know where you are, you know who you are, and you know what you will no longer allow. And for the first time, you can set boundaries without feeling guilty. You can walk away without feeling abandoned. You can say no without fear. This firmness doesn't come from the ego, but from awareness. It doesn't need to be defended because it simply exists. Watts said that when someone discovers this kind of strength, the entire universe rearranges itself around that person. This reorganization provokes a final emotional climax. You realize that, contrary to what you imagined for years, you no longer need to fight to be seen or understood. You no longer need to prove your pain, your truth, or your worth. This need disappears because what you previously desperately sought outside now comes from within. It's as if an inner door, always locked, finally opens. And when that happens, you realize that nothing binds you to the old chains anymore. Nothing. Not fear, not guilt, not invisible loyalties. The connection to the past unravels like a thread that, after being stretched so much, finally breaks silently. And this silent rupture prepares the ground for the conclusion of the journey. Because when you reach that point, you realize that everything you've lived through, every wound, every confusion, every frustrating repetition, was pushing you, little by little, toward a place where almost no one arrives. A place where you can finally choose your life, not just survive it. Watts said that this is the true beginning of freedom, the moment when consciousness finally takes the wheel of its own existence. And it is precisely at this threshold that the story approaches its decisive point. Because now, with a clear mind the past understood, and the cycle about to be broken, the final question arises that will define the conclusion. What will you build from this freedom you have just conquered? Alan Watts said that life was never about avoiding suffering, but about discovering who you become after going through it. And when you get here, to the final point of this journey, you realize that something fundamental has changed within you. It's not just intellectual understanding. It's not just emotional clarity. It's a change in how you occupy your own body, your own name, your own life. It's as if you've spent years walking in a dark labyrinth and suddenly find a silent exit that was always there, but only now becomes visible. Watts asserted that awakening is not a dramatic event, but a sudden recognition. You finally realize that you are in control of your own consciousness. This realization brings about profound reflection. Everything you've experienced, from the earliest confused childhood memories to the most difficult moments of adulthood, was leading you to this discovery. You are not what they made you. You are not what your family projected. You are not what the past tried to imprint. You are what you choose from here on out. And this choice is not abstract. It is practical, concrete, daily. It is how you respond to situations that once brought you down. It is how you position yourself in the face of conflict. It is the courage to set boundaries, even when your entire history tried to teach you not to have any. The truth is, when you awaken, you realize that many things weighing you down weren't yours. The guilt you carried had no owner. The fears that haunted you weren't born within you. The patterns that shaped you weren't inevitable. And this generates a huge emotional impact, because for the first time you can separate who you are from everything that happened to you. Watts said that this separation is the essence of freedom. Freedom isn't doing what you want. It's knowing that you don't need to repeat anything that was imposed. It's looking inside and realizing that there is something intact, luminous, inviolable there. But this freedom only becomes real when you start putting it into practice. And perhaps that's the most important point of this last stage. Awakening is useless if it's not lived. It needs to gain momentum. It needs to take shape in daily life. It needs to appear in your choices. And here are some clear paths so you can transform this understanding into concrete action. First, observe your internal patterns without judgment. Each strong emotion that arises, anger, fear, anxiety, guilt, is a door that opens. Instead of reacting automatically, breathe and ask yourself, is this mine or is it inherited? This simple question interrupts decades of repetition. Second, establish a boundary you've never been able to set before. It doesn't have to be big. It could be saying no to something you've always accepted out of obligation. It could be refusing an invitation that makes you feel bad. It could be ending a conversation when it crosses your emotional threshold. These small gestures reshape your identity. Watts said that each boundary marks a point where you choose yourself. Third, allow yourself to feel without punishing yourself for it. People who have lived in chaotic environments learn to doubt their own emotions, as if feeling were a mistake. But emotions are signals. They are information. They are internal mechanisms pointing the way. What you feel now is not weakness. It's a compass. It's your body showing you what needs to be healed and what needs to be left behind. Watts taught that consciousness does not reject experiences. It illuminates each one of them. Fourth, start building a life that is not a response to trauma, but an expression of who you truly are. This might mean changing habits, renovating environments, seeking new connections, cultivating silence, finding practices that keep your mind centered. It could be meditation, walking, writing, therapy, studying, art. The important thing is that whatever path you choose, it is chosen by you and not inherited. When you choose for yourself, you automatically break the chain of repetitions. And here's the most profound turning point. By transforming your consciousness, you're not just changing yourself, you're altering the entire trajectory of your lineage. You're healing wounds that have spanned generations. You're opening a space that never existed before. You become the point where the cycle ends. Watts said that each awakened person is like a lit candle in a room that has been dark for a long time. Just one flame is enough to change the entire atmosphere. You are that flame. From this point on, everything you experience becomes an opportunity to deepen this new identity. Conflicts cease to be threats and become tests that confirm your evolution. Emotional triggers cease to be internal monsters and become signs that you are healing deep roots. Silences cease to be suffocating and become spaces for reconstruction. Relationships cease to define you and begin to reflect who you are. And above all, the past ceases to be a prison and becomes merely the soil where you planted the seed that now grows. This is the point where the journey finds its true meaning. You didn't come here just to understand what happened. You came here to transform yourself, to choose, to assume the place that has always been yours, but that only now you can occupy with full awareness. Watts would say that when someone reaches this point, the entire universe breathes differently because an awakened person alters the fabric of reality around them. And before we wrap up, here's a final thought. Everything you've experienced, absolutely everything, has brought you to this exact moment. And now the question is no longer, why did this happen to me? But what am I going to build from this? That's the question that defines the beginning of a new life. If this video touched you in any way, please like it so that more people can find this content. Comment, even anonymously, because your experience can help someone who doesn't even realize they're not alone. And subscribe to the channel to continue on this journey of awareness, healing, and awakening. The transformation begins here, and you are a part of it.